We, of course, are in the midst of, some would say, well, some might debate whether or not it's begun or will in the future, but there's a power transition that is occurring between the United States and China. China being a rising power, given its vast economic growth, the United States, if not stagnating, in decline. It leads us to wonder then, after reading this book, what potentially can we learn about this power transition from your work? Mm-hmm. Is there a way that the United States can legitimate China as a great power and ensure that this power transition also ends in peace, or is conflict inevitable?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that is the question, right? Mm-hmm. That's why somebody who looks at my book will be interested in reading my book, unless you're a history buff and you want to just read about these old cases. That's where the payoff is, though, right? It's where we get something useful. So think, okay, what do these historical cases, what does this theoretical framework, what lessons does it bring to current politics, to current international politics? And I think it's also an interesting, with the sort of cases of the book, to think about this question, because oftentimes when talking about China, people refer to Imperial Germany, right? And they ask, right, is Asia 1914 Europe? Mm-hmm. Is it going to be the same kind of thing? Entangling alliances, rising powers, declining powers. There's a lot of the same dynamics, right? That analogy and comparison is made quite often. One of the things the book does is say, yes, maybe, but also there was this other thing going on at that time too, right? There was another power transition happening. And so we should look at both of these cases side by side and think, all right, what lessons can we draw for the future? So I have a couple of things to sort of raise. My ideas on this are evolving in part because U.S. foreign policy is evolving every day.
Every day.
And I think, a lot has changed since the 2016 election, and I think a lot of the kind of stable currents in U.S. foreign policy are disrupted, which on the one hand makes prediction difficult. On the other hand is also a moment of opportunity, because all of the forces that we think kind of discipline U.S. foreign policy are perhaps up for grabs. I'll lay out a few ideas that I have here. The first thing I think is the toughest, actually, obstacle to a peaceful power transition, and it's not about China, it's about the United States. Yes. And the way in which the United States understands itself and its role in the world. For quite a long time, but particularly since the end of the Cold War, right, the United States has understood itself to be the kind of one indispensable nation, that it was sort of destined to rule the world, for lack of a better word, that it has a kind of special providence to order the system, created the liberal international order that we see in the world today. I think if the United States wants to facilitate China's peaceful rise, then it's going to have to accept that it is not the sole arbiter of the system. It can't decide simply by itself what it means to be a great power, and its vision for global leadership is not universal. There's a kind of recognition of ourselves that has to happen, right? Yes. A recognition that the narratives that underpin our identity need to change. Now that's tough, right? Identities are powerful things. The narratives that underpin them, particularly in the United States, are deep, they're historical, they tend to be unchanging, right? They vacillate, but they're kind of in the same lane for most of the time. So I think that's a really hard question, because I think the answer requires something quite difficult to happen within the United States in the first instant. Related to this, I think it includes recognizing that the liberal international order is a Western order. It's an American order, right? It's not neutral. Mm-hmm. It places the United States at the center, right? And some of our colleagues in the field, Bill Woolforth and Stephen Brooks, right, argue that that order, in fact, is designed to perpetuate American hegemony, right? Yes. It's not just simply to bring goodness to the world and prosperity to the world. It's to perpetuate and essentially let American hegemony live forever. So there needs to be a recognition that that is the case. And I think that the two dominant approaches currently to China in U.S. foreign policy do not recognize this about about the United States or decenter the United States from this process. This is obviously true with containment. The point of containment is to prevent China from rising. So obviously there is very little recognition going on there. But I think perhaps more interestingly, engagement strategies are also not sufficient in this regard, because the goal of engagement is to bring China into the US-led international order, right? It's to socialize China into Western norms, into kind of America's system of play. And so it does nothing to destabilize the US's role in defining that order, in leading that order, right? It's about socialization, not recognition. So I think the kind of raw material of US foreign policy right now is not particularly well equipped to do this. Secondly, something else that makes this quite difficult, the US and the UK power transition teaches us that a shared identity that constructs a rising power and an established power as part of a single community makes recognition possible, or at least makes recognition easier. There's not a lot of raw material to work with between the US and China, right? This is not like Anglo-Saxonism at the turn of the 20th century, right? Anglo-Saxonism, like I said, was a racial and cultural identity construction, and there's no equivalent in play between the US and China, and indeed a great deal of distance between those two. We don't have a shared history. We don't have common narratives to kind of draw from and create. So the raw material is not there. That being said, before the 2016 election, I would have said that climate change, I think, is a potential area where that narrative could be constructed, a kind of exogenous shock to the system that would create the kind of discursive space to place the US and China on the same team. Interestingly, I think China has, even if only rhetorically, positioned itself as a leader on climate. I think after the 2016 election, right, it came out and said, we're prepared to lead in this area. I think there's arguments that its material rise will be aided if they do indeed do that, right? If they corner the market on solar and wind and things like that, that might actually jettison them materially. But at the same time, and with the election of Trump, the US, that has become sort of demobilized off the United States set of interests, right? So it's reducing its salience. That being said, I think the idea that China and the United States might share a common fate connected to the climate could be an area where those identities could be constructed.